Hi, everybody. This is Damien from Legend Life. As you know, I'm all about sharing interesting and inspiring stories about people who are living their best life. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Peter Gostelow. Peter is a cycle tourist who's traveled close to or more than 100,000 Ks across 70 countries. He's biked from Japan to the UK and then from the UK to South Africa, and has done multiple tours around Africa. So I think he's clocked up close to 50,000 Ks across Africa. So how are you today, Peter?
Well, I'm great. Yeah. My legs are feeling rested because I'm currently sat in isolation from being with somebody who had COVID. So yeah, my legs are not feeling like they might have done after a long day's bike ride. But yeah, I'm certainly looking forward to getting back on the bike and touring more, hopefully later this year when COVID starts to perhaps disappear if it will.
Yeah, I think we're all waiting for that to happen. So, Peter, let's get started, and you can maybe give us a little bit of a background about yourself. Where you developed your interest in, getting outdoors, having adventures.
Okay, it's hard to really pick up. I mean, now when I look back at my childhood, I grew up in a small village in Nottinghamshire, in the Midlands, in England. And so I had a lot of freedom as a child. I played lots of sports, and growing up in the 1980s in a small village in the UK, my parents gave me a lot of freedom. I used to ride my bike a lot, played lots of sports. So I was always pretty much an outdoors kind of person. But I never was cycling as a competitive sport. It was more just using it as a kid to play around. But anyway, fast forward years later, I finished school, went to university, finished university, and I took off traveling. I took a year off and went to Africa, not with a bicycle. I had a friend who used to live in Southern Africa, and I went to visit. And I think that was really the sort of spark for travel, because I ended up going by myself. And I hadn't traveled independently before. So as a sort of 21-year-old in Africa, traveling around using public transport, I think that was the initial sort of travel bug that started. But there was nothing with cycling at that point. I did meet a few people who were traveling by bicycle, and at the time I thought it was absolutely insane. I really hadn't seen how you could sort of travel day upon day and cross borders. But I came back from that trip still kind of fueled with a wanderlust to travel and see more of the world. And I think if I look back, and I remember at that time, there wasn't much on the internet in those days, but there was one character whose story I picked up upon. It was a German cyclist or tourer who's quite well known in the touring community, called Heinz Stuck, I think he must be in his 80s now. But his story was he left Germany as an 18 or 19-year-old in the late 60s, and he basically spent his entire life traveling around the world. I think the pictures that he'd taken and his story kind of sowed a seed about using a bicycle to travel with, and that led on to reading other books or coming across stories of other people who travel by bicycle. So that kind of idea fermented in my head for a few years. Fast forward to sort of my early mid-20s, I went to Japan to teach English. So I trained to become an English teacher, and I went to live in Japan. And during the 2 years that I lived there, I cycled around the island that I lived on a lot. And I took panniers and I had a tent. So I think there was one trip that I did for about 3 or 4 weeks independently. I cycled around the island of Kyushu, which is one of the main islands. And I just loved every part of it. The simplicity of cycling, the freedom, the exercise, it just all connected together. And I finished that trip just wanting basically to travel more. I could keep on talking, but if you want to interject with any questions here, that's fine.
No, it's fine. I mean, like, I guess the next step would be, what kind of like inspired this idea of like biking from Japan all the way back to the UK. I mean, obviously,
Well,
you had an
yeah,
interesting, or you had an interest in cycling now, but this is a big kind of like shift. I'm going to bike all
yeah,
the way back to the UK.
yeah, it was. So to put it in realistic terms, I mean, I'd been living in Japan, and I knew, well, I could have stayed there, but I decided that the contract that I was working under was going to finish, and I wanted to do something big. I just basically wanted to travel on the bicycle and do something bigger rather than like a 2 or 3 week holiday. I'd saved money in Japan. I had money saved, and I'd realized I mean, one of the aspects of traveling by bicycle is I'd realized that once you have your bike and your gear and you set off, then you can actually travel with quite a low budget. But I was in Japan, and I didn't have any plans to move on to another job at the time. So I just remember looking at a map that was on my wall. I think I was 25-year-old, 26, and thought, what a crazy thing it would be to try and travel all the way back to the UK by bike. And I thought, how do I go about doing that? Because there's so much planning involved, all the logistics. But one of the key things that I had, which I always tell people when they ask questions, is I had time. And I thought, if I've got lots of time, then I don't have to worry too much about how things might be in like 1 month or 2 months. Of course, you're traveling and you're funding it yourself, so you've always got to be cautious or aware of how much time or money you have to travel with. But I had time, and anyway, I set off just cycling in Japan. I literally just spent several weeks traveling around or cycling around another island. And then I just took the first step, which was taking a ferry from Japan to South Korea. And then I spent a month in South Korea. And I remember looking at the map of China thinking, wow, can I really travel through this enormous country? I don't speak a word of Chinese, Mandarin. But at that time, I was, in those days, this was sort of 15 years ago, there were forums on the internet, Lonely Planet forums, and I was getting as much information as I could, but really for cyclists, there wasn't a lot of information. So I just went ahead and did it. I don't know how that just must sound like kind of blasé, but I just took each day as it came, and I slowly just pieced together a route. But if you look at the route that I took to go back to the UK, it went all over the place. I went from South Korea, then to northeastern China, and then I went south. I mean, I arrived in the northeast of China in October, so I didn't want to cycle through central China during the winter. So I cycled all the way down the eastern coast through like quite industrial and very polluted provinces. When I look back at it, definitely not places I'd choose to cycle through again, actually, but it was really an eye-opener. So all the way down to Hong Kong, and then I went through Southeast Asia, and then I came back up through China, and went through Tibet. So I mean, this trip that I did, which took 3 years, there's a number of countries now which would be much harder to travel through. I mean, one place that I went through, I was very lucky to go through, was Tibet, because back then, even though it was still restricted for foreigners to travel there independently, it was possible. So that trip, I just took it in stages, really. Everything was just kind of dependent on if I could get a visa and how long I could stay in the country. In essence, I was kind of making it up as I went along, but I was trying to be realistic in what I could and I couldn't do. And yeah, it was 3 years later that I got back to the UK. But people ask me, well, were you cycling every day? And of those 3 years, I spent probably more days like not cycling than I did cycling. So that one aspect of my cycle tours, which hasn't changed, is I've never rushed. I mean, a lot of people kind of approach cycle touring from a sports perspective, like performance. They try to, pedal so many kilometers a day and almost try to, well, some people want to do it as a sort of endurance sport to break records. So, you'll have people who'd cycle all the way through Europe in the space of a few weeks. But for me, that was never the focus, and I don't think that's the kind of spirit that most cycle tourers get on the bicycle for.
So your idea is more to experience the place, and then the bike is just a more interesting way to kind of like experience the place?
Absolutely, yeah. It's depending on the country, but in general, I think traveling at the speed of a bicycle, so traveling at 15 kilometers to 20 kilometers an hour, or much slower if you're going uphill.
Yeah,
it's the right kind of pace, because, well, you just see things much clearer, and you have, I guess it's the simplicity. I mean, the other aspect, I mean, I remember before I chose to travel on the bicycle, I sat down and made a list of all the reasons to travel on a bike and all the reasons to travel on a motorbike, because I thought traveling on a motorbike would also offer some of the same aspects that cycle touring does, and it does definitely. But I think the bicycle, it was more the simplicity, not having an engine, so that there's a feeling of self-reward from pedaling through places. But it was the right kind of pace, the freedom, and also there's a difference. You travel through villages, and you see people on the roadside on a bicycle, and you're not covered in this helmet and all this bike gear. It's just a much simpler form of travel, and so even though you're kind of vulnerable because you're just somebody on a bicycle, which in many countries when there's a lot of traffic, you're a long way down the sort of hierarchy of road importance. But I think it's much easier to connect with people and places on a bicycle than it is if you're driving through in a big vehicle or even on a motorbike. That's my own feeling. But
yeah, no, that's an interesting perspective, because yes, you're right. Like a lot of people travel, even if they're not cycle touring, just to kind of check the box. But are they really experiencing the place? I mean, because they're in such a rush just to kind of like do all the activities and say they've been here, but they've not really kind of like engaged and fully immersed themselves in the experience. So when they come back, they've just checked off a lot of things, but they haven't really had the experience, have they?
Well, everybody does it for different reasons. Some do it because they want a challenge, a physical challenge. So for some people, it's much more about the bicycle, what the performance aspect, and all the statistics that you might be able to calibrate and share with people from that. Because even when I finish these trips, or when I meet people, a lot of the questions often are about, physical aspects of your performance and what kind of bicycle you need, and I try to sort of bring it back to a sort of simplicity that really all you need is the kind of determination and the motivation, and obviously a bicycle, but it can be any bike. Of course, a bike which is better prepared for long distance travel is an advantage, but it still just has to be a bike. And I think some people get delayed or caught up by worrying about all the things which are actually less important than just getting out on the road and going. My focus is a lot of it's been off the bike. I've always felt that traveling by bike's just been a way to connect with people and places that I couldn't do when I was traveling by public transport. Although traveling by public transport, but whether it's a bus, train, boat, is also fascinating. But I just remember sitting on lots of uncomfortable buses and being delayed. I mean, when I think of traveling, particularly in Africa by public transport, you can spend hours just waiting to move, and then you sit on a bus and you barely got any space. So on a bicycle, it was all that sort of sense of just having complete control, your own form of transport, and just something that was simple, really.
Okay. So after 3 years, so you had a bit of time in the UK, and then you decided, okay, it's time for the next adventure. So what inspired the idea to kind of now go bike to South Africa?
Well, I think that first trip that I'd done after university, it left a mark in my mind. I wanted to go back to Africa. I really wanted to go back. And after I'd made this big trip on the bicycle, I think I was only probably halfway back, probably cycling through Iran or somewhere in the Middle East, and already thinking I'm going to go back to the UK and then prepare for another big journey. So I got back to the UK and I spent a year in the UK, and I gave quite a lot of talks in schools about the long ride home, as I called it, from Japan to the UK. And I got back into teaching, so I did some more language teaching. But I kind of set a date that I was going to set off a year later, and that's what I did. So I rode out of a small village in southwest England where my mum was living. I'd never been down there before, but she was living in Dorset, which is where I cycled back to. And I set off again, and again, I didn't really have a time plan, and the route that I chose to go through Africa wasn't quite the conventional route. Most people who do a sort of north to south or south to north of Africa usually sort of follow sort of Cape to Cairo route through Eastern Africa, but I decided I was going to go through West Africa, so I followed the west coast of Europe, so through France, Spain, Portugal, and then I took a boat across to Morocco, and I basically followed the west coast of Africa all the way down. So Morocco, Western Sahara, Mauritania, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, all the way around the sort of Ghana, Nigeria. And then I think for quite a lot of the trip, I thought, how am I going to get through what were quite difficult countries? I wasn't sure I could get a visa for Angola, and I wasn't sure I could get a visa for the Congo, but I was able to get a visa for the Congo. So I traveled through Central Africa and traveled then through East Africa, so Rwanda, Uganda, around East Africa, and then back south. So that route also kind of sort of snaked across the continent.
Yeah.
And yeah, there were incidents and things happened on that journey. Again, I was spending more time probably off the bike than I did on. So it was almost 3 years again on the road before I got to South Africa. It was a very different journey than the long ride home in some ways. Well, obviously, because it was just a different continent. So the people and the countries, the landscapes were different, but equally fascinating. So yeah, that was the second big trip I did. Yeah.
So that took you three years, and you covered something like 34,000 Ks?
About that, yeah, about that. I mean, I wasn't following any specific route. I was cycling both on paved and unpaved roads. Again, I just wasn't taking it. I just used to look at a map. You know, in those days, I mean, things have changed so much in the last 5 or 10 years. But in those days, I say it sounds like a long time ago, which in some ways it was, and in other ways it isn't. It wasn't or isn't. But I was dependent on paper maps, and it's amazing now, like the detail that you can obviously have from digital maps, all of the apps on smartphones, which I never had. I mean, that first trip I didn't even have a phone. I had no phone at all. The second trip, I just had an old like Nokia So no Google Maps or
Yeah.
anything. But I love looking at paper maps. The more maps I could get hold of, the better. But generally, African maps, they don't have much detail. So, you know, sometimes I would be on main roads, but at other times they would be terrible tracks. But now, when I think about if I was to tour again in Africa, and sometimes I do, I realize that all of the opportunities that exist now because you have these maps. You see, there are so many tracks and routes which connect villages and places which aren't really on paper maps, but they do exist. You would see them on Google Maps and you would see them on other apps, but if you don't know about them, then finding them would be much harder. So I think travel has changed in some ways because, well, it's obviously changed because of technology, but but back then, those maps. I suppose actually both trips, I always was attracted to getting off the main roads. You know, when I looked at a country map, and often main roads might be coloured red, and then the secondary roads would be coloured yellow, and then the small village roads would be coloured white. So I always wanted to be on the white roads. I always wanted to be on the smallest roads, because I thought on a bicycle, well, they're the safest because they don't have any of the big traffic, or, you know, trucks or buses.
Yeah.
But they're also the most interesting because you're going through places that few people would go through, and people would think that you're lost because you know, you're on a tiny track and you arrive in a village and it feels like the middle of nowhere, and people would think you're lost because they ask you, you know, where are you going, and you tell them the city and they say you've come the wrong way because obviously there's a main road which you should be on. But that was never the focus. The focus was always the experience. And so the smaller the track I could be on, for me, the more sense of adventure and challenge it was.
Yeah.
And because of that, that was probably why I spent so long traveling through these places. Yeah.
No, well, as you said, like I think your approach to travel is more the experience and to have a journey, like to make it kind of more experiential than just like tick things off, get to the place the most quickest way possible. You know, so no, I'd agree. It's kind of like an interesting approach, kind of like go outside of the main to kind of actually see how a place actually works, rather than, you know, just go through the main places where, you know, like, you know, I've traveled a bit, and then a lot of places now are very westernized, so you don't actually feel like you're in a new place. Like if you go to Shanghai now, it's completely different than it was like 15, 20 years ago. Like now it just looks like any other big city. But when you go outside of the main city, you get the actual feel of the place and what it's actually all about. So I think you're right. It's important to get off the main road, and if you really want to see a place, to go where the locals go and then kind of like experience what they're experiencing.
Yeah.
So what would be some of your more memorable experiences, you know, traveling through Africa? Things that kind of always, you know, jump into your mind and you'd like to.
I think having the opportunity to travel through the Congo, I spent 10 weeks there, and you know, I'd always looked at this country as like a place of amazement because it's like this enormous country in the center of Africa, which has a lot of history, but then, well, all of the countries do, but not so many people have traveled to in recent years. And I think I'd probably been inspired by reading, you know, sort of stories of traveling on the Congo River. So like Heart of Darkness, which is a famous book. So I remember looking at the map and seeing this enormous river, which I suppose if you look at a map of Brazil, you know, you look at the Amazon and you'd see this enormous beast of a river, and you'd be fascinated that you wanted to actually see it. And And in the Congo, well, yeah, it was unlike anywhere else, really. It was a difficult journey to go through on by bicycle because a lot of the roads are terrible. There's tremendous poverty there, going through villages with, yeah, very little signs of any sort of modernization. But in terms of experiences there, I spent, well, actually 2 times I was on the river. So I spent the first time was about 10 days on a barge, which, because the roads are so bad there, basically the river is a major form of transport, and the Congo River, and they have like these enormous barges which are like floating markets, and they transport hundreds of people both up and down the river, and people spend weeks on this barge, traveling often all the way from the capital Kinshasa all the way up to Kisangani, which is the second city, which is more than 1,000 kilometers away. And people are on the river to basically sell and buy goods from people who live in villages along the way. So to be on that barge for 10 days, it wasn't easy in some ways, but it was absolutely fascinating. In some ways, it did feel like a bit of a step back in time, because you're traveling through places which really probably haven't changed at all in the last 40, 50, 60 years. There's almost no sign of sort of westernization, which for somebody traveling there is really exciting, but in other aspects, you know, it's also, you know, very sad that this whole part of the continent or the country has been neglected, and there are all sorts of problems there which continue to this day. But so when I look back, traveling through Africa, I mean, that experience, some of the places I slept, I mean, I often slept in my tent, and I tried to remember, you know, one. Well, I often recall this story. Well, I could recall many, but one was sleeping. Because it rained a lot at night, I always used to try and find kind of shelter. I didn't want to sort of pitch my tent completely under the sky, because if it rains at night, I mean, it's like tropical rain in I guess in Brazil, it just comes down so heavy that your tent would just not stand it. So anyway, I used to try and find some kind of thatched covering to sleep under. Now that I'm giving this story, I'm thinking about another story. But one story was I camped in a church, and it was open thatched, and I pitched my tent there in the middle of the church, and must have been about 3 o'clock in the morning. There was a congregation. It was completely dark. People probably just came with small lights, and anyway, I think there was like there was a service, but there was a pastor who I think he was basically, there was a lot of chanting, and they were like there was some kind of exorcism going on, and screaming and shouting, and drums beating, and the whole time this was happening, I was in my tent, which I didn't have the fly sheet, the rain sheet, so it was just like a mesh mosquito net, and I was lying in my tent, and I remember just lying there, like listening to these drums and all these people chanting really loud, and I was thinking, are they aware that there's this like tent or foreign object in the church? And I remember just like getting up. So I remember like rising up from like lying down, and at the time I was thinking, they must think this is absolutely bizarre, because nobody actually knew that it was this foreigner, this white guy who was like rising up from lying down. So like the imagery in my head was like a dead person like rising up in the middle of the church. So yeah, that's just one story. Another time sleeping in the Congo, I actually stayed in a village clinic, and the doctor had told me that I could sleep inside the clinic because it was going to rain heavily. And I remember that night very well again, because it was a clinic whereby I was like in a waiting room, and on one side of me, I remember there was like screams and shouting, and on the other side there was also screams and shouting, and I didn't really know what was going on, but I found out in the morning that in the room next to me, yeah, one person had died, and then in the room on the other side, a woman had just given birth to a child. So there were so many like emotional stories from my travels there. But yeah, when I look back on it, they're just events that I could never really forget. So yeah, I feel like I'm rambling on about.
No, it's fine. I mean, no, well, that's why we go off and travel, isn't it? To create memories that we can kind of
Yeah.
reflect on. I mean, like I think all of us, the power of having an experience is pretty immense, because like I can remember things that happened when I was hitchhiking 23 years ago, like they were yesterday. So I think when you have real experiences, they kind of like etch on your brain, and then the things we should be aiming to have more of, because they kind of make your life a little bit more interesting.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Africa, it's got a I think a lot of people, when they think about Africa, there's a lot of security issues and perception of danger, etc. So what's your perspective, and what kind of recommendations do you give to people? Because like obviously we're kind of like relying on the media and the news, and sometimes they're kind of exaggerated, and then it's a little bit different than on the ground. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, of course, I think the media often portrays places in the wrong light or in a negative light. I could say that traveling through Africa is no different from traveling anywhere, but that would be like way too generalized. Of course, most places that you would travel through, at least if you're traveling outside of big cities, you would encounter people in villages who have far less materially than you would do. So you'd see children who may not go to school, or who are not wearing shoes or don't have correct clothes. So I think as a Westerner, you've certainly been made aware of like your privileges, that the things that you take for granted don't exist there, and because of that, it can be quite challenging mentally, because demands might be placed upon you. Your Western guilt will be challenged both by children and adults. So issues of begging and asking for money and sweets. But that's not just Africa. I mean, I encountered a lot of that in countries in Asia. I haven't traveled in South America, but I'm sure that also exists. I think crime in general, again, it's quite generalized, but and I haven't traveled in South America, but most places in Africa, as somebody traveling, of course, crime does exist, but it's more petty crime in terms of, of course, if you leave valuables, they might get stolen, but it's much less common, like gun crime. So if I think of countries, Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, in general, most people you meet are incredibly welcoming and friendly and hospitable. But there's always going to be usually a big gulf in terms of where you've come from and your background and theirs. When I compare that to say cycling in Europe, I think one of the biggest differences that people note is, as a Westerner traveling in Europe, a white Westerner, you're pretty anonymous. You could sit down anywhere and people would ignore you. So in that sense, it's easy, it's peaceful. But generally, as a white Westerner traveling through Africa, you're always going to be receiving a lot of attention. You're never anonymous. So you've always got to just be somehow aware and comfortable within yourself to be able to, walk through that market or walk through that village with everybody looking at you and people shouting and children getting excited and wanting to touch you or chase you. So for some people, I think actually when I think of quite a lot of cycle tourers, Some people really crave solitude and isolation. They love the idea of just cycling in the wilderness, and then camping in the wilderness and doing that again the next day. That does exist in some places, but there are a lot of places where that doesn't exist. And actually, when I think about traveling and camping in a lot of Africa, a lot of the time I did camp, it was in villages, and I'd ask permission to sleep there. So I would camp next to a primary school, or I'd camp next to a church, or I'd camp next to somebody's home. And because of that, I was always going to be like a source of entertainment for the whole village. If you're camping in the wilderness, it depends where you are, but often it's, if you're traveling on a road which is used, you're never very far away from where people live. And I've often said, like, if you're planning to sleep or like camping wild close to where there might be people living, I never really felt so comfortable doing it, because I'd much prefer to ask permission from somebody, which I did most of the time, and sleep in a sort of village compound, rather than trying to like be like some kind of stealth traveler and camping in the wilderness. And it's never so practical, because usually when you're traveling by bicycle, you always need water. So where is the water? It's usually in a village. So you would go and you would ask where to get water, and then at the end of it might be in the evening. So naturally you would ask, where is the safe place to sleep? And particularly as if you're traveling by yourself, I mean, this is another aspect. I mean, it's quite an alien thing to be doing in a lot of cultures, to travel by yourself. So, you know, to want to travel by yourself and then want to sleep totally by yourself, away from people, that's quite an alien concept for a lot of people. So I sort of became aware of that and realized that if somebody said that I could sleep by their house, and often they want me to sleep in their house, then most of the time I would accept it, because to not accept it, I would be making myself seem like a bit of a more strange than I already am.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Understood. What about the animal experiences? Because I guess like touring Africa is a little bit different in Europe once again, because it's wild. You still have like lions, you still have elephants, you still have a lot of wildlife available. So that must be pretty amazing as well.
It is, but again, it's a bit of a misconception. I mean, most places in Africa where there are large animals like, you know, elephants and lions, in most places they're in national parks. Yeah. And most national parks you're not allowed to cycle through. You can cycle through some, and I have cycled through some, and I have encountered elephants and giraffe, buffalo on the roadside at a distance. But that's not like a daily norm. You know that it's quite likely that you might see large animals because you're going through a national park. It's almost, well, there are a few countries like Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe. There are some places where you can travel and see large animals outside of national parks, but that's definitely not the norm in Africa. So sleeping in national parks, if you're going to camp in a national park, it's more likely you'd be camping like in a designated campsite, and that campsite would have fencing around it. You know, you'd be pretty foolish to to camp in a national park where it's known that it's an area where there are lions and elephants. And in general, when I think of the big national parks where there are animals like that, they usually wouldn't allow somebody to travel by bicycle. So I kind of feel it sort of disappoints people when, you know, I sort of say, oh yeah, you know, the road is like, you know, littered with like lions and elephants. That's not really the truth. So in general, when I camped, I was always much more aware or afraid of people than I was animals. Yeah.
So for anyone, because now you've traveled extensively through Africa, so beyond the trip to South Africa, I believe you've done multiple tours beyond that. So I think you've clocked up over 50,000 Ks.
Yeah,
So you've
yeah. I
covered.
lived in Tanzania for several years, and I traveled a lot by bicycle then. And the last big trip I did was from Tanzania up to the UAE. So I cycled through the Horn of Africa, so up through Ethiopia and Somalia. So yeah, I haven't cycled in Africa in the last several years, but I feel well experienced in terms of
Yeah,
coverage of the
no,
continent. Yeah.
definitely. So for anyone who's considering traveling to Africa, what kind of recommendations would you have for them? So getting started, preparation, and then actually executing, getting off, and starting to bike.
I think the simplest thing is just to be like realistic with the amount of time you have. So the idea of traveling from the top of Africa to the bottom, in 3 months. Well, yeah, it is possible. There are people who travel 100 miles a day every day, and they just want to go from A to B every day and finish. So you have to ask yourself what is it you want from the experience? Is it to travel more in a smaller area and experience more, or is it to travel as far as possible? So I think first and foremost, it's like to know how much time that you have, and also not to be too focused on having all of the right gear. Of course, there's so much equipment you can buy, but the most important thing is, I'd say, it's obviously to have a bike, but basically decide you're going to do it, book a ticket, and stick to it. If it's a trip that you're going to do by yourself, then you plan it accordingly. But these days there's so many forums and opportunities to connect with people that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago. So whether it's Facebook groups, you could say, I'm planning a trip through Tanzania and Kenya. I'm doing it independently, but if anybody would like to join, and even though there are not so many people who are cycling in Africa as there might be parts of the Americas or Asia, there are other people. So I think just to be open to meeting new people. I think technology just provides you with a great opportunity to connect with people. You don't have to be on your phone, like connecting on Instagram or Facebook, but it's that technology is there to provide you with a lot of help and information, but to actually just execute the trip, I think you just have to take that brave first step, which is commit to it, and committing to it is basically booking a ticket and saying, okay, I have 3 months or I have 6 months, and I'm going to do it, and then taking a map and looking at the map and having a guidebook or the internet and saying, okay, I definitely want to go here, I definitely want to go here, and then just joining things up in between. But all of the real day-to-day things, they just come as you travel. You can't plan everything. I think you have to adapt and just be flexible, particularly with everything that's happened with COVID in the last year or so. So many people have had to change plans or adapt their plans, that you just got to be flexible.
Okay. So are there any key elements to your kit for traveling? So beyond the bike?
Not specifically. I mean, the thing about cycle touring, I mean, in general, traveling in Africa, you're not really going to be like in cold weather climates. So you don't need a 4-season tent, and you don't need a really hot sleeping bag. I mean, a lot of the time you wouldn't even need a sleeping bag. And in terms of clothing, I mean, I've never really been one for cycle clothing. When I say cycle clothing, I mean all the synthetic fabrics, particularly in Africa. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just very simple. You know, I used to cycle with padded cycling shorts. Now, or in recent years, I don't cycle with any padded shorts. I just you break a saddle in and get comfortable. And in terms of footwear, again, when I cycled in Africa, I just had sandals on that I could wear on and off the bicycle. It really was just like whatever you're comfortable in wearing. So, you know, there's so much like equipment and and different like equipment that you could buy. But I mean, I think Africa is one place where it definitely be noticeable. I mean, I sort of, you know, the idea of camping in a village and getting your titanium mug out, and the cost of your titanium mug would probably feed a family with rice for like months on end. So all of that just becomes like you become very aware of it. So beyond the bike, I really just think that keeping things simple is key. Yeah, I mean, it's very different from, say, planning I don't know, an expedition to like summit a mountain, whereby it's really important that you focus on exactly what kind of gear you need. That is not the case with cycle touring.
Yeah, understood. So what about the mental aspect? Because obviously being by yourself, you know, as you said, you encounter other people, and then obviously you try to connect with the people in the villages, etc. But still, at the end of the day, you're by yourself for a long period of time. And, you know, how do you keep yourself motivated? You know, you're in the middle of Tanzania and you still got hundreds of miles to go before your next destination.
Yeah, so I never really thought about it when I was doing those trips, but I think those trips kind of cemented the knowledge that I was comfortable in my own company. And then when I look back at when I was younger, perhaps going through university, or even before, I was somebody who was always content by myself. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that I'm not sociable and I don't enjoy other people's company, but
yeah.
I was always content being alone. And I know that for some people, that's just generally not their character, and they always need to be with other people. And if that's the case, then of course you can connect with other people to cycle with. But in terms of staying motivated, I think I just always like focused on the next day. And I used to just sort of sit down or lie down at the end of the day and think about all the things that I'd seen and that had happened. It might have been an amazing day of scenery, or it could have just been a really shitty day with terrible weather. But I always thought, well, tomorrow is another day. I'm going somewhere new. I'm going to meet new people. Let's see how it is. So I just took each day as it came. And in terms of, I mean, back then, and I would do it again. I always kept a journal. I used to try and write every day, you know, just from the boring aspects about, you know, what I ate, and but also the people I met. So keeping a journal, and well, I mean, these days, I mean, back then, I used to read a lot more books. I used to carry paperback books. Well, now I have a Kindle. And now I have like a smartphone, and the reality is in most of Tanzania, unless you're really, really remote, you know, you're going to get reception on your phone. So, you know, you could be sitting in your tent alone and having a WhatsApp conversation with anybody and anywhere in the world. I mean, you could look at that as like a great thing, but also a tragedy. But the reality is, you know, you're never going to be so alone, because the technology can bring people together.
Yeah. So what are what things do you believe you've kind of like learned from your adventures, you know, both about yourself and, you know, the world in general?
Yeah, I had to write these down because I thought if you asked me without well, I think one thing, I guess I know, well, I say notice it, I don't know, it sounds like sort of cliched, but but often both cycling through, well, everywhere actually, Asia, Europe, and Africa, but it's often been the people who have the least often have the most to give in terms of like their time and being hospitable and just open and welcoming. I mean, it's a cliche and it's a generalization, because I've often met people who are incredibly wealthy who've also been incredibly generous and interested. But I've often met people who've got absolutely nothing, like materially. At least I see that. But they're much more open and receptive than perhaps just your average person who is sat behind the wheel of a fancy car and just drives past you. So that, I guess that's one thing. In terms of like learning about myself, I think some of that, maybe the things that I learned to become or that have helped me, is not just from traveling by bike, but traveling in general in places you're not familiar with different cultures and customs, is just to be patient and tolerant and respectful of other people's beliefs and cultures, even if you disagree with them or that you don't accept them, people's opinions. I think about traveling through Pakistan and Iran and places where people are very strongly Islamic and have very strong views. And they would ask me on a daily basis about my religious views, and I just had to be both just careful and acceptive and not to be outspoken, because I always wanted to remain somehow neutral, and so those things, but definitely just being patient and tolerant. It's amazing, because when I say come back to a Western world, or when you come back to a life that you might have led before, and you see people getting stressed and they get anxious and they worry, and their time is so important. I think all that travel just taught me to be a bit more relaxed. Maybe I was like that before, but just if you're not getting the answer or somebody's not helping you to begin with, then just take a deep breath. It's like when you're at an airport or somewhere where there's a queue and nobody's moving, and you look at people around you and they get really stressed because they're angry because nobody's helping them, and you think you just want to get. And then I think, well, it will happen. Let's just be patient. And somebody is giving you an answer and it's not the answer you want, then think of a different way to phrase your question, and definitely never lose your temper with somebody, because most of the time that never really helps you.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
Yeah.
Cool. So I guess this is a good lead into, what would you say to other people about adventure? Would you recommend it to people? Because nowadays a lot of people, 9 to 5 behind a computer, have a routine, but really don't have any kind of like real adventures in their life. So for them, what would you say about having an adventure?
Yeah, I mean, when I looked through your questions earlier, and I realized there was a focus on, age as somehow a defining factor about what you can and cannot do. So the idea that perhaps when you're in your 40s, you should be taking life more seriously and focusing on the future. Whereas when you're in your 20s or 30s, you're perhaps more carefree. Well, everybody's in a different situation and circumstances. You can be married at 20 with a few kids, or you could be single in your 40s or 50s with none. But I think, and again, it's a cliche, age is just a number. I'm 42, and I feel as fit and strong as I did when I was 10 or 15 years younger. So I think you know, in terms of, I'm going a bit away from the question you asked, but yeah, in terms of like embarking on something that might be physically arduous, I just think age is not a barrier, as long as you look after yourself mentally and physically, and you eat well and you stay fit. You can continue to be active in your 40s and 50s and even beyond. I mean, it was always an inspiration when I was traveling to meet both men and women in their 50s, 60s, even 70s who were traveling by bicycle, and traveling by bicycle is, again, you're not trying to break a record, so who cares if you're cycling 30, 40 kilometers a day, or 90 or 100 or even more. Traveling by bicycle, it's not as arduous as perhaps wanting to I don't know, trek to the North Pole or something like that. But what was the original question you asked? It was
basically, well, you've answered one of my questions, so that's pretty cool. So no, but like more the need for adventure, the benefits of going off and having an adventure, like, what it kind of adds to your life.
Well, it just enriches it. I mean, if you're spending all day, every day, sat in an office or following a routine, and time is passing you by, the world is a wonderful place, even with all the problems that are existing. But you have the opportunity, or you make the opportunity, even if you only have a week, out of a year or a month or whatever, there should be no excuses or reasons why you can't take off and do something different, something out of your comfort zone. I mean, for me, traveling by bicycle, it's somehow in my comfort zone because I'm familiar with it, but going to a new country is always like out of my comfort zone because I may not speak the language, I'm not familiar with things, but being out of your comfort zone, it's not a holiday, but it's exciting. And when you look back on it, it's incredibly memorable, and you learn things both about places and about yourself, and it doesn't matter what age you are. So I think adventure, it's a much overused word, and you don't have to travel to Mongolia or somewhere to have an adventure. I mean, this coming year, this spring and summer, it's quite likely that I'm going to be traveling on the bicycle in the UK and Europe, but I'm just as excited about that as I would be perhaps cycling through Central Asia. There's so much to see and experience, that I don't think adventure has to be something or somewhere which people deem to be challenging.
Yep, no, very good point. So basically, even when you're living in your wherever you are, you can still look for a weekend away or something that could be a little bit adventurous, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And for a lot of people, like sleeping, camping outside. So the idea of like wild camping and sleeping in a tent in a woodland or a field, for a lot of people, that seems a bit strange or odd, but it can be great. It's waking up. I think one of your questions that you haven't asked that I wrote answers down to is describe your perfect day, and I was going to say waking up in my tent with an amazing sunrise with a beautiful view, having a coffee outside, packing the bike up, enjoying the cool, clear air, getting on the bicycle, cycling for 6 or 7 hours, stopping somewhere where somebody's selling like fresh fruit on the roadside, and then pitching my tent somewhere like late in the evening and somewhere scenic again. So being outside, being in nature, these things are possible. And you don't have to like obviously get on a plane and travel like thousands of miles away. If you're living in a city in Europe or the States, and you're surrounded by like buildings, well, you may not have to travel that far before you're out in the countryside. and you can experience, you know, the great outdoors.
Yep. No, very true. So you're mentioning you're going to look to travel around the UK and Europe. What other things would be on your bucket list? So you've done 2 or 3 major trips. Do you have another one that's kind of like in the back of your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to cycle the Americas. You know, I always thought, you know, get the bicycle up to Alaska in May time, which is perhaps the earliest, and then cycle down through Canada and the States. But when I when I look at the map, I think, I mean, I could just spend like years just traveling in the States, and then just finding somewhere that's warmer in the winter, maybe going down to, like, you know, New Mexico, Arizona, and then, but anyway, but I do look at the Americas, and I definitely look at cycling through South America, but it's not going to be this year, and well, we'll have to wait and see what next year brings. But of course, it's always been in the back of my mind to do another big trip.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I will make it happen. I mean, we've not spoken. There are lots of other influencing factors about, you know, what allows you to take a year or longer out of your life. So, you know, as you might guess, I'm not married and I don't have kids. So some things like taking a long trip is easier when you don't have those. But it won't be this year. So I'm actually looking. So I'm finishing my job here in the next few months, and I'm looking at spending a good 2 or 3 months cycling in the UK and Ireland. There's a lot of my own country and neighbouring countries like Wales, Scotland, that I really hardly know. And every time I do go back to the UK, whether it's in the winter or the summer, which hasn't been that much in the last several years, you know, I'm always made aware of how much of it I don't really know. Yeah. I think a lot of people always feel that, you know, they've got to travel outside of their home country to have some kind of adventure or experience, but you know, there's so much like around where I am that means I don't have to get on a plane, you know, to go and travel somewhere.
No, awesome. So here's a question that I like to ask everyone. So what's your definition of a legendary life, or your best life?
What's my definition of legendary life? I don't know what's my can you, like, how can you be, I mean, like that question, when you say legendary life, what do you mean by that? Because I'm just trying to.
Well, basically everyone's got a definition of what living your best life would be for you. So you personally, you know, in all aspects of your life, what would it mean? What would it mean to be living that kind of a life? So across all dimensions, it could be just, you know, having lots of adventures. What for you would be your definition? You know, how you want to spend your life. You know, so if you're looking back, you're age 90 and you look back in your life, you'd go, I had a pretty awesome life because I felt I wasn't time constrained. I did all the things I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I lived my authentic life.
Yeah. So I think essentially, you know, age is just a number. You know, have a dream, be a realistic plan. Don't. I've never really given up on my dreams or plans. I mean, I kind of shelve things and put them away. I mean, I think, you know, one thing that's in the back of my mind that has been for, you know, 5-10 years is, you know, I started writing a book and I never finished it, and it still kind of plays on my mind. So, you know, I think documenting your life, and I have documented it in terms of the travels I've done, you know, blogs and website, and you know, that's kind of brought my trips together. So living a legendary life is basically just to believe in yourself, to do things that you feel that you're capable of doing, not to be influenced or pushed to do things that you're not comfortable with, or do something because somebody else tells you to do it. I mean, people thought it was crazy that, that I was going to cycle from Japan to the UK, and they said it was too dangerous. And people said the same thing about traveling through Africa. And often when you tell people that you're doing something, a lot of the people who don't do them always focus on the negative. So they'll ask questions about, isn't it too dangerous, or what about this, what about that? And of course, you can't ignore that there are risks and dangers with living your life in such a way. But I think there's far more positives. And I think if you have a positive outlook about places and also believe in other people, I mean, I think so many people are afraid of other cultures and religions that it prevents them. They hold on to sort of grievances or stereotypes. So I think to just be open-minded and to accept that people are different, and to have that kind of positive philosophy and outlook all the way through your life. I think there's a lot more that you will enrich yourself with that, and people will be much more open to understanding you if you see them in that kind of way. Does that make sense?
No, it definitely does. I mean, I think that covers a little bit of, things that you've learned or life lessons, things you would, I guess because you've had a lot of experience talking to children, etc. And then, it's good telling them about the experiences you've had and then the things you've learned, and then relating that back to them. So, specifically beyond what you mentioned about not being influenced by others, being true, never put your dreams completely away. You can always kind of cycle back, be open-minded. Are there any other kind of lessons you'd share with other people, things that you think pretty important and then could have value to other people?
I think just to be open and generous. Yeah, I just think that to understand and respect people for their differences, and in terms of living a life that there's so many problems in the world which seem to sort of focus or originate from disagreements which need not be there. So whether it's something connected with religion or connected with beliefs, I think that people just should embrace or be open to different cultures and different beliefs. And I think people can hold on to that when they travel somewhere out of their comfort zone, then it will enrich their life. I think fear holds people back so much, and I think fear of others creates many of the problems that exist. So I don't fear. I think one of the things I learned from travel is to fear less, and I know that it may sound cliched and generalized, but that's what I generally feel. So traveling in all those places in Asia and Africa, places that on TV must seem scary and dangerous, or even sitting in a car and looking out of the window, if you just stop and you take the time to look at somebody in the eye and you smile and they see you as just another human being from somewhere else who may not speak your language, then that simple point of human contact is what matters most, I think. And I think that's how people should live their lives.
No, that's brilliant. Well, thanks, Peter. It's been awesome speaking to you. I'm sure a lot of people will get a lot of value out of this. How can people find you online, to learn a little bit more about some of your journeys?
Yeah, I mean, I've been really lazy with my website in the last several years. So the easiest way is generally through Instagram, because I've actually put most of my travel experiences there with stories from the photos. So yeah, the Instagram, what do we call it, handle, or Instagram name is Pete Gost, Pete Gost. That's, and then that has, you know, a link to a website, but I'm generally easily contactable there, just as you found me and contacted me that way.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks again. It's been great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed it as well. I look forward to perhaps watching and listening some of it when it goes up.